Well, good morning, Coffee Chat people and fellow Flat Belly travelers. I'm going to do a brief video here, which I shared at the last Coffee Chat meeting a few days ago. And the topic here is goals. Somebody had suggested the idea of goals. We never covered that specifically. We covered stuff similar to that. But I'm going to use a whiteboard today because this is somewhat graphical. I won't use it right away, but I will fairly soon. Start out with, I want to talk about a quote, or a story actually, shared by a guy named Leonard Perlmutter. There's a video on the blog, coffeechat.webs.com, which shows what he was talking about there if you listen through the video. It's very graphical. He talked about how the ancient sages of yoga used to tell their students that they had 3 groups of metaphorical arrows. The first arrow was represented by the ones that they had already shot in life. You could say that represents their past. In other words, they have to accept the results of the arrows. The arrows are gone. The second set of arrows are the ones which they currently have drawn in their bows, but have the free will to shoot in any direction they want. The third set of arrows are the ones represented by the ones they still have in their quivers, which they can draw upon at any time, and once again, with their free will, shoot in any direction they so desire. And today I want to share 6 points on how we, you and I, each and every one of us, can take better aim at what it is we want in this ordinary everyday life. We all have things we want. To go and get groceries, to go to our jobs, to take care of our kids, to deal with our relationships and so on. The question is, how do we do it more effectively? The first point is, I'm using some paperwork here, so the first point is, it is actually a point, it's a dot on the whiteboard. I don't know if you can see that, but it's a dot right here. And what that dot can represent is you or I, or a group of us, in this very moment, recognizing that we have a desire for something. That's to start with. But the first thing I want to draw here from that is a line like this, with an arrow on the end. And this represents point number 1, which is time. Any goal that we can imagine, things that we want to achieve, take a period of time. Therefore, we can see that time is a valuable resource. Just like when we shoot an arrow, it takes time to go from the time it's released from our bow till it hits where it's going. So every goal, therefore, has a timeline, and we have an arrow on the end of the line to represent the time keeps going. We can put a mark here when we think we want our goal to achieve. Just take an example. Say somebody wants to achieve an education, and it's a 3-year education starting from now. This is the spring of 2012. So it would be, say, May 2015. That's a timeline, because that's what the school says, whatever, it takes 3 years. And this is a graph chart. Some of you people will recognize it. If you're a mathematician, you may recognize that on a chart very often there are 2 axes. This one's normally called the x-axis. What's this one called? This one's called the y-axis. W-H-Y axis, right? The reason I call it the y-axis, it's a bit of a pun, I guess you could say. But for whatever we do in life, whatever we go for in life, there's always why are we doing it, which establishes, and if we can get in touch with why we're doing it, it establishes a purpose for what we're doing. So all the actions that take place to get us here have a purpose to them and a meaning, and therefore it makes it easier. And the reason there's an arrow on either end is because we could also call this is point number 2, by the way, I also call it the quality choices. Because whatever we strive for in life, we end up with a quality as a result. Have you ever gone out on a tear some night, when you were younger maybe, and ended up way down here in the dumper, not feeling so great? That's like we shot one of those arrows and it didn't turn out so well. But when we consciously go and strive for something, we're not consciously striving to end up in the dumper, are we? We're striving to end up with a quality, and somehow we perceive there's a quality involved in that. And in getting an education, we can put a line here. It's just an arbitrary line on the quality, but it means a representation of increase. And we can call that, maybe we would consider that to be a sense of achievement. Could be anything, but sense of achievement. And with these 2 points, it's just graphical. It's a graphical representation. So some people are graphical. I tend to be graphical. And if you are, this may work for you as well. We can triangulate now from here and here where it is that are real goal lines. It's not just a timeline. It also represents a quality we want to achieve, right? We shoot across here and across here. Now we know where to shoot our arrows. If we're just blindly shooting arrows in life, we don't necessarily hit exactly what we want. But when we give it some thought, plot it out, we can see it more clearly. And that is point number 3. Point number 4 is, well, not quite yet, but the question then comes, how do we get from here, this is where we are at this dot, to here, where we want to be? Well, in a very ordinary sense, on a graph chart, all we do is we draw a line, right? It doesn't quite work that way in life. These are ideals. That line will be all over the place in getting there, right? Normally. But there are things that we go through along this line of achievement, which are represented by dots, and represent them as dots, but they take place all the way along, nevertheless. And the first point, which I'm going to call number 4, point number 4 of the overall, is if we have our arrow being shot, if you can imagine installing a scope on that bow, we can therefore have a better sight and a better aim at where we're going. So the first thing we want to do is get better aim at this. And we can do that through planning. Something called planning. And some of you who've watched some of my videos before will recognize that I actually gone through this before. I use different words on this line. But this is for goal setting, so I'm using words that are in alignment with a lot of what you hear in terms of goal setting. Words like planning. I'm going to make a few sub-points on planning, because planning is so important, because it's the first step. Without the first step, we're just blindly shooting arrows in life, metaphorically shooting arrows and not getting what we want. So what this does, planning, is first of all, it reinforces this. It brings it into our here and now. A good example of that is building a house with or without plans. With plans, we get to see a certain aspect of that house. We get to hear and feel the plans. It becomes more real. It's like a vision. We can almost visualize, and when we can visualize, essentially, what we want in the now, down here, we get to actually experience a little bit of this why, and it makes it more real as we go along. The next point is, we can better coordinate what it is that we're going to do throughout our trip. You can imagine, in that example of the house, without plans, how do you really coordinate with great efficiency? With plan, you can see how the foundation is built, what materials you're going to need, what sequence to go in. You see what I mean? Without that, we could constantly be just making things up and just shooting aimlessly and end up with something that's a mess at the end. We could, right? So another point is, along that lines, is it increases our efficiency with our resources, our time and those involved, the material involved, and so on. Because with a plan, we can set out a list, an itemized list, you might say, of not only the materials that we're going to need, but the schedule, the timeline. We begin to sort of break it down, if you will. And I'll cover it a little bit later, but there's a good video on the website. It's the first one I ever posted, actually. You got to go back in time a little bit in the videos. But it's by Will Smith, and there's a little clip in there about how when he was a young guy, his dad got him to rebuild a brick wall on the front of their family business. And his dad was able to teach him how to break it down. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But the next point that planning helps us with is it helps us to see that challenges and obstacles along the way are not only possible and inevitable, but part of the deal. We get to realize that for everything that we go for in life, there's a cost. We go to a store and we have to pay for it. We want to get in shape, we have to sweat a little bit maybe. Well, and if there's people involved, many people involved in our plan, some people may quit or leave or get transferred. So when we recognize that right from the get-go, it's not a surprise when it happens. And therefore, it leads us into the next point, which helps us to be more flexible. In other words, we don't just set the plan once and forget about it and think that it has to be rigid. No, we can roll with the changes that we see, because sometimes when we start out with anything, we don't, as clear as our plan can be, we don't see the whole picture until we start going along. An example of that might be when we're building a house. The plan looks fine on paper, but then when we finally start building the main floor, we realize, you know what, this kitchen is a little bit small. Maybe we'll just move the wall over. So we can be flexible in that way. And therefore, that leads into the final point on planning, which is that we can constantly review it along the way, all the way up, because we see these changes that take place, and it helps us to keep it in mind and keep this in mind. It keeps it in our consciousness, in our focus. I remember an example years ago when I worked for a little car dealership. There was a board just like this in our lunchroom, and the sales manager every week he would write down the goal for the week, and then he'd write down all of the salespeople involved. And whenever each one of us would reach our individual sales objectives, we'd check it off, and there'd be a little bit of a celebration in the lunchroom for that achievement, because each little step helped to achieve the larger step. But the point being that there was this constant review that went on every shift, which helped to keep this in mind as we went along. That was a lot on point number 4, I know. But point number 5 is probably the biggest stumbling block of all in terms of achieving goals. And this point is called realistic / measurable. And some of you who watched this before, I used to call this in some other ways that I draw believability. Because if we cannot see our goal as somehow realistic or even measurable, we just end up in this phase as far as we would get, become basically mere daydreamers and never moving on to the next level. If for some reason we see that our education in 3 years is not doable, because all we're doing is looking at this big picture, then we're never going to get to the point of seeing it as realistic and even measurable. This can be helped along in a lot of ways, but the main way that works for me is by breaking it down, and I'll tell that story a little bit, I'll touch on it again, but you can watch it on that Will Smith video, because it's actually a part of a video. You kind of got to scroll through the video and find it. But the story was something like this. His dad tore down the facade off the front of their family business, and it was a brick facade, if I can remember correctly. And he told his two young sons, they were in their early teens, to rebuild the wall. And Will Smith told his dad, "Dad, I can't do that." And his dad told him, "Yes, you can, and I'll show you how." And he said, "Look, you take this brick, and here's how you lay that brick." And he asked his son, "Can you do that?" And his son said, "Yeah, I can lay one brick." And his dad said, "Okay, you do that day after day, and you lay those bricks as best you can, and in time you'll have a brick wall." What lessons did his dad teach Will? He taught him about being realistic, and he taught him measurability. You see, Will was looking at the big picture, and it was daunting. And his dad helped to break it down into an individual goal, a smaller goal, which was seen as realistic by the young guy. And also, it was measurable, because now when you can do each step, you can see that each step is building towards the bigger. So when we can get ourselves to see it as realistic, then we can move on. Because imagine this. Imagine we can see this. We want this. We want this because we want this sense of achievement. We want it in this timeline. We have a plan. We can see how to do it. And it becomes realistic. It's like we know what we want. We can see it clearly. And we completely believe. It gets to the point of complete belief. It's like a faith. A strong faith that we can do it. All of a sudden that prompts our will. Our will. We become willing to do what it takes. And that doing what it takes is called, point number 6, action. And we've heard it a million times that action is what will move us forward. Because when there's action, there's always results. And when the action is done with the careful planning, the pinpoint planning, it drives us right towards this goal. But action is so important. I mean, we can see the broom in the corner. The broom is not going to sweep the room. At a certain point, we've got to get up, grab the broom, and do what we got to do. And I'm not going to say a lot about action, really, because my points were in here and here, because when this is well done and becomes realistic, and we take action, we begin to move towards on benchmarks. And we can plot out, you know, what we talked about with Will Smith's brick by brick by brick. Another thing we can do is, when we itemize things, we can timeline them along like this. We can write them out, what we have to do, in terms of actions. And an education is a good example of that, because we have individual modules of courses and whatnot, and we can break them down and schedule them out as to what works for us in terms of our time and where we are in life. And then we're just looking at that one, at that little goal. And then that one's done in that little goal. It's like brick by brick by brick. And by this way, we have a smoother transition. It's a smoother ride by breaking it down all the way to here. So we're not just looking at that, we're looking at little chunks at a time. The question is then, to us, to all of us, is where are our proverbial arrows pointing? Are they pointing to what we want with the pinpoint accuracy of our planning? And are we able to see them as realistic? When we can release them, willingly release them. And with our actions, we will achieve our goals and therefore experience our qualities that we want. Those are my words on goals. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you in another video.